The pattern of questions has come in concerning Israel, and that's understandable, especially given Israel's military action to take out the nuclear facilities in Iran. And of course, that's an unfolding story even now. But representative of the questions that have come in this issue, a woman listener from North Carolina writes saying, recent events in the news have led me to wonder about our obligation as a nation and as faithful Christians to support the modern state of Israel. She says, I pray for the peace of Israel and for wisdom for the Israeli and American leadership, but beyond that, do we have a religious obligation to defend the modern state of Israel? In other words, if Israel faces an existential threat from a nation such as Iran, should we step in to defend Israel militarily? Okay, that's a very interesting question. I think it's very intelligently posed in this case, and the issues are put before us, certainly in the headlines these days. Do Christians have an ethical obligation to support the state of Israel? I think the answer to this question is yes. I also think it is a defined and qualified yes, and so I'm going to need to define and qualify it. I'm going to explain why yes, and I think I need to explain why it's a qualified yes. I think we need to turn first to Scripture. You'll recall that in Genesis chapter 12, we find what is known as the Abrahamic covenant. That's God's covenant with Abraham. And the Scripture says, quote, Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So that's a very familiar text of Scripture, and it's a precious text. I want to state emphatically, I believe that the Abrahamic covenant is one of those blessed covenants established by God to reveal his glory and his unfolding redemptive purpose. I believe that all of the old covenant is fulfilled in the new covenant of Christ, but I also believe that all the promises of the old covenant will be fully realized, and that means that I believe there is a future purpose for the nation of Israel, biblical Israel. And I believe that the principle established in Genesis 12 continues. The question is, where is biblical Israel? When we use the name, we invoke the name Israel. Of what or of whom are we speaking? And so I here need to make a distinction. Some people are going to say immediately, well, the answer is, the obvious answer to the question, where is Israel, is to look to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean and find the state of Israel. It's a nation on the map. You can find it on the globe. There is biblical Israel. Now, I just want to say there is the state of Israel. And I have to make a distinction theologically and biblically between biblical Israel and the state of Israel. It is not that they have nothing to do with one another. I actually believe that biblical Israel is, in a very real sense, being protected and preserved for God's unfolding purposes inside the state of Israel. But the state of Israel has its own history, and that history includes the emergence of the political state, the nation state, in 1948, and it also includes some complications when it comes to the fact that many of the Jews who established the state of Israel, and I think it was such a noble act, they did so nonetheless as largely secular Jewish people, and many of them were committed even to socialism. Well, let me just state very clearly, the covenant that God made with Abraham, the covenant that God established with Israel as his personal possession, is a covenant with the spiritual people established as the descendants of Abraham. Now, should we befriend the state of Israel? And my answer to that is emphatically yes. I am not, however, stating that the state of Israel, the nation, is a theological obligation to the United States of America. I think there is a larger obligation, and I think that was recognized even by, say, President Harry Truman when he was the first major world leader to recognize the state of Israel in 1948. All right, when you look at the New Testament, and I believe, well, let me just state very honestly, I'm a premillennialist. Let me put my theological cards on the table, so to speak. As a premillennialist, I believe that all of the promises given to Israel will be fully fulfilled, and that includes the territorial promises given in the Old Testament. So I mean that in space, time, and history. I am looking for the complete fulfillment right down to the inches of the territory designated for Israel for God's glory. I believe that the realization of this, the fulfillment of this, will happen in the millennial reign of Christ. I'm a premillennialist, so I believe that Christ comes and establishes that millennial reign. Of course, his reign is eternal, but there is that 1,000-year period in which you have the establishment on earth from Jerusalem of the reality of Christ's kingdom, all of its principles, all of its power in the reign of Christ with the saints. But to whom did God give those promises? I'm going to argue that those promises were not given to the modern state of Israel established in 1948. They were given to biblical Israel. And here's why I say the answer is yes, we should befriend Israel, the state of Israel, but it's a qualified yes. It's not qualified as if we say, well, it's partly yes and partly no. It's qualified only by the understanding that the state of Israel is not, here's a big word, coterminous. It is not absolutely identical with biblical Israel. I do believe that in the providence of God, the state of Israel is an important holding and protective vessel for biblical Israel for the unfolding purposes of God. I believe the state of Israel is not to be immediately and without qualification identified as biblical Israel. Biblical Israel is defined theologically, and I think this was pretty clear in the establishment of Israel by secular leaders who intended to establish Israel as a secular state. That's what they said. The majority of them were influenced even by Marxism. A good number of them were socialists. They saw Israel as a secular nation, and in some ways, even if not denying, they suppressed its biblical identity, even as they, in so many other ways, claimed it as a mandate. Now, not only as a political interest, as a geopolitical interest, but as a theological interest, I want us to look at this question. I want to be very careful. I do not believe that Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister of biblical Israel, an office which, by the way, doesn't occur in Scripture. I do believe he is the prime minister of Israel, the nation, and I believe that that nation is providentially instrumental in the survival of biblical Israel for the completion of all things according to God's perfect and unalterable purpose. For the completion of all things according to God's perfect promise and unalterable purpose. But I want to press this case just a little bit farther. Let's say, I think it's also important to recognize that on purely secular terms, the United States should see the state of Israel as a key ally. And I think that's how the basic relationship between the U.S. and Israel has operated, going all the way back to the recognition of Israel by President Harry S. Truman in 1948. By the way, he was persuaded, at least in part, by a major Jewish friend who made explicitly biblical arguments to him. So I think that's an interesting part of the history between the U.S. and Israel as well. And the relationship between Israel and the United States, the state of Israel and the United States, is crucial going all the way back to 1948. But immediately after the formation and even the recognition of the state of Israel, political leaders in the United States, and that includes also some of our European allies, weren't sure exactly what to do with Israel. Now, there's another background issue here, and that was the Holocaust undertaken by Nazi Germany. There was the sense that there was a moral mandate to create a recognized nation state for the Jewish people to represent the continuation of Judaism and of the Jewish people. And that led to the fact that there was an intuitive support for Israel, but it wasn't clear how Israel fit into the geopolitics of the region, not to mention of the entire world. That has been tremendously clarified. And clarified in some horrifying ways by Israel's fight for its own existence, an incredibly brave and courageous fight going all the way back to 1948. And Israel exists in a context in which it knows that it is surrounded by so many nations, and in particular, you could put Iran at the top of that list, who have dedicated themselves to the non-existence of Israel. And so Israel knows where it stands in the world, and it knows who its friends are. American support for Israel really began to come in the late 1960s and even in the early 1970s, particularly in a succession of wars between Israel and Arab states. And so the United States has a lot of interest in the region, has a lot of interest with the Arab nations in the region. And one of the things that has happened just over the course of the last several decades is that, largely due to the United States in its own geopolitics, our own geopolitics, there has been an outreach to Israel and to many Arab states, which have actually become functionally much more friendly to the existence of Israel. And the fact is that Israel and so many of these Arab states now have a common enemy. And that enemy is, on the one hand, just anarchist, terrorist, Islamic fundamentalist groups, but it is also particularly Iran. Well, in the context of the Cold War in the last century, with that in the background, other issues, oil, all a part of the equation, you did have the increased recognition on the part of the United States that there is one, and there is only one, constitutional government with any kind of democratic legitimacy there in the Middle East. There's only one government that qualifies politically as well as, say, militarily to be an ally of the United States in that sense. There is one and only one government that seems to represent America's understanding of the world in that region. And even just in moral terms, on so many different issues, there is a commonality. Now, since that time, there have been other majority Arab nations that have moved closer to the United States and implicitly to Israel in allyship. But there's simply no doubt that the United States has and always has had, to some extent, especially since the 1970s, the United States has had an exceptionally close relationship to Israel. And Israel, by the way, should be recognized as in so many ways acting on behalf of the United States, whether that's a stated goal or not. To put it another way, when Israel defends itself, it often does so against threats which are directed not only to Israel, but to the United States and to the global order the United States wants to see kept in place. Israel takes a lot of hard shots. It takes a lot of the hard shots that are intended for others. It also receives a lot of constant reminder that its very existence is at stake. Israel knows that it is constantly having to fight for that existence, and thus Israel, it takes action where sometimes the United States would not be quite so ready to take action. I think that's exactly what's taking place right now. Israel has taken action in terms of the nuclear threat from Iran. It has a friend in the United States who also is absolutely committed to preventing Iran from developing a usable nuclear weapon. But the U.S. has a bit of time. You even see that right now in statements coming from the White House. The U.S. wants a bit of time to think these issues through. Israel tends to plan far in advance and be ready to meet this kind of threat. And Israel tends to act without some of the hesitation that might be reflected by other nations. Just based on a secular perspective, I think the United States has to see Israel as an incredibly important ally. Frankly, you've seen this in explicit statements from President Trump. He seems very clearly now to acknowledge that what Israel is doing is not only justified in terms of the action in Iran, but also necessary. That's a key statement of allyship. We'll see what comes beyond that. And of course, the big question right now is to what extent the United States under President Trump will or will not become a direct participant in terms of the military action against Iran. But, the issue here is that Israel has taken the action. The United States wants the action taken. One way or another, the relationship between the United States and Israel is going to be abundantly clear. But I don't want to speak about this merely in secular terms, precisely because I'm a Christian. I want to speak in Christian, in biblical terms. I think that Christians in the United States represent an even deeper understanding of identity with the Jewish people and with the state of Israel. And we also make the theological distinction, understanding that God's promises are to biblical Israel, and those promises, speaking of those territorial promises, are part of the larger context of God's redemptive purpose, and I believe that is to produce one saved people, saved by the blood of the Lamb. I guess that one of the most controversial aspects of the future of Israel when it comes in biblical terms is the fact that biblical Israel will overwhelmingly turn to Christ as Redeemer, and that will be again to the infinite eternal glory of the one true and living God. I think that the existence of the state of Israel is a part of God's providential purposes in setting the stage for that to happen. Christians need to remember that in the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul speaks of the fact that it is we who are grafted onto the promises of Israel. And Israel, in the unfolding purposes of God, will represent a victory for the power of the gospel and the reign of the Lamb. And we will have the fulfillment of the promise that is given in the clear teachings of Scripture and the power of God unto salvation. That's what the gospel is, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. We're watching right now the unfolding of history being lived out right before our eyes, but Christians understand there is more to it than just history. There is that which is to come in the promise of God, and for that we await, and we wait as friends of Israel. We wait for the unfolding purpose of God and the unveiling of His glory, and all flesh shall see it together. Thanks for listening to The Briefing. For more information, go to my website at albertmohler.com. You can follow me on X or Twitter by going to twitter.com/Albert Mohler. For information on the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, go to sbts.edu. For information on Boyce College, just go to boycecollege.com. I'll meet you again on Monday for The Briefing.